And thanks everyone for dropping in today, and thanks for all your messages there. I can read them all. Thanks. Okay, so look, today I kind of wanted to go over, as I said in the introduction, some ideas that I've been playing around with. This is not necessarily a paper that I'm writing, although it does just flow into a few ideas I've got at the moment with projects. It's kind of a common theme that I wanted to, I guess, explore and also touch upon some of the confluences between a couple of projects that I'm doing. So I'll just, I'm still kind of working my way through Big Note. But first off, I guess we'd kind of start off with the project that really prompted the idea behind this presentation, and that's this is a project that's ongoing that I'm working on with Bernie Jenny, and also Michael Nyland and Su Yin have done a lot of modeling for this and helping out with this. This is a project in collaboration with the CSIRO. So really what this is, it's kind of modeling, it's based on the ecosystem model framework that some collaborators of ours at the CSIRO have been assembling. And I really wanted to talk about how the elements are put together and some of the directions this has led me on. So I think it's, with the time that we have, I might come back and play a little bit of the video, or maybe I'll play some of the video now. So this is the video that we did. This is something Michael Nyland put together. But what you can see here is a view of the scene, and it's a bit laggy on my screen, but hopefully it's working okay on your screens. But you can see that this is a full Unity environment. It's made up of probably maybe a dozen models, not many models, but they're very repetitive. And they're kind of patterned across the landscape. And this also works in VR at the moment, and Bernie and I took it up to Canberra in February, and we went to show a whole lot of people, perhaps maybe 40 or so people in little groups of 3, 4 at a time. And they were like landscape ecologists, people working in the Department of Environment. And we were trying to work out how this could be used to kind of simulate different scenarios of landscape management, but also trying to simulate ecological change in landscapes over time. And the particular landscape we were looking at was called the Box Gum Woodland. So I guess here's some shots of from the VR scene. I don't want to show the VR, particularly in the video. It doesn't come across as well. But you can see we're kind of looking at different parts of the year, and you can see the composition of the ground cover of the grasses, as well as the trees in the sky. These things will change from season to season, and then of course we kind of went into a night cycle as well. And a lot of the important things here are what about the sounds? This is a kind of unexpected outcome of the VR. Is what different kinds of animals you'd hear at different types, different seasons and different times of day. And then we didn't really, because it was quite a limited project in terms of budget. I think it went over about a year, but it was probably about $10,000 altogether. So we were trying to work with all these photographs that our colleagues at the CSIRO were sending us as kind of, these are, I guess, what you call the base system model. And all of these are native species. So you don't find them very commonly around urban environments. You really have to go looking for these kind of assemblies of native species. And while we were showing all the participants up in Canberra, a landscape ecologist came up to me and said, look, you know, this possibly could be historical, because it's very, very hard to find them, these kind of ecosystems, exactly as you've modeled them in such, pristine condition. They're all damaged in some way. And this got us onto the conversation about how this is a recurring thing, that every generation's kind of inheriting a landscape that's less complex and more damaged than it was before. But of course, this is normalized in every generation because we only really grow up with what we know. So the landscapes that were around in Australia 100 years ago, and when I'm talking about landscapes, I'm really talking about the composition of grasslands and woodlands. These were very different to how they are today, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But it got me thinking about how we might have created an archive of an ecosystem, which it probably does still exist, but it might not exist for much longer. So we were kind of modeling something that's historical when we were actually trying to model something that was current and if threatened. So how these landscapes are actually created? Well, we're using a lot of photographic textures on models, but of course they don't look exactly like a photorealistic landscape. It's not about modeling all the twigs and leaves exactly as they look in reality. You've got to simplify quite a lot of things. So I guess the procedure is very similar to the one we've been using in other projects like Angkor and like the Monash Country Lines Archive, but of course, we had to be a little bit more general here. So you can see these are the kind of models that this is what makes up these tree models. And I guess this also, if we were to switch over to what Mike and I are doing in teaching, the same kind of procedures for landscape modeling, we're teaching these in immersive environments where students they have like 4 or 5 weeks, and they start from the real basics, and often they're doing low polygon landscapes, but these are made in Unity. But it's the same kind of approach. They're trying to model a convincing ecosystem, even if that's an imaginary one, where colors and atmospheric effects and I guess the ecological consistency of what kind of vegetation is there is all taken into account. So this is something we're doing it in teaching at in a little bit of a more simplified way. And I guess I'd like to show one of Brent's images from an animation here called Purdy One, which he did quite a few years back. But the way that Brent can take a Northern Territory landscape and then abstract down the shapes and abstract down the foliage is a real skill, and that took him quite a long time to master. But he can do that with almost any landscape now. And the trick with that is obviously to try and keep it from getting really too loaded up with polygons. So it's the same kind of technique, but you can see how this is geared for animation. Of course, it's not geared for Unity necessarily, but you can see how these landscapes are kind of assembled. So this led me to think about lost landscapes and lost ecologies and how they're kind of represented. And I'd like to go with very much local examples here. I mean, very local to Melbourne. So if we think about the Heidelberg School of Australian Impressionists, which is, you're talking about the 1880s, 1890s, 1870s to some extent. And these two very well-known paintings by Frederick McCubbin and Arthur Streeton. And I'm not going to do it here on this screen, but if you zoom in to have a look at some of the detail here, what I noticed here is you can see in the painterly strokes that Streeton has, a lot of the small grasses and flowers, that a lot of the similar species, you can't be sure if they're the same ones, but you can see them in these paintings. And this is Eaglemont, which is now quite a built-up suburb in Melbourne, but that's how it was in 1889. And a lot of those species are there in the paintings, even if they're only represented just with a few brush strokes, but you can clearly see them, and they're not there anymore. Also in this painting, Lost by Frederick McCubbin, you get, this is at Box Hill, which is, of course, is a major shopping centre, major, very, very built up part of Melbourne now. But that's what it was like then. And it just got me thinking about the kind of I guess the connections between what we were doing with this project in VR and how you actually try and use historical paintings as references to go back in time to try and recreate stuff that is partially there or not quite there or was there at some stage. So when we're talking about historical ecology, and this is, I said in the introduction, I'd try and I guess explain it a little more, but I think it's probably best as just a quick blurb now. It's been around for a while, and it kind of tends to come out of 4 different disciplines: history, ecology, geography, and anthropology. And it's the common theme is that there's a historical interconnectedness of nature and human culture, but as a field, it doesn't really have a unified methodology or institutional background or common publication forum. So it's kind of an interesting cross-disciplinary area that I'd like to look at a little bit more, and that's really the preface of this talk. But I'm not going to talk specifically about historical ecology. I'm really interested in how virtual heritage, which is an area I've been interested in for a long time, how that kind of interweaves with that and how it can overlay with that. So looking a bit further, these are not historical, but they're kind of in the same vein. These are little pictures I took from the Melbourne Museum website when they're really reconstructions of, I guess, paleobotanic landscape. So it's not strictly history, because it's going back millions of years and certainly before humans existed and before written records existed. But I guess it follows in the same theme and it follows in the same continuum. So in order to kind of reconstruct these landscapes, these are not definitive places. They're really just renderings based on fossil evidence of the kind of communities of plants that would have been around at certain locations where they're dug up. And then I guess the paleontologists have to also look at where the continent was actually placed when these fossils were dug up, because continents tend to move around. So these are also kind of windows into the past, which are really assembled with just little threads of evidence. And I guess in terms of, one of the great scientific artists, scientific visualizers that is well known now is Peter Trussler, and he's done quite. You've probably seen his images in museums and on stamps and around Australia. So he's done a lot of work in trying to paint scenes based on fossil evidence, and really, I think a lot of his expertise comes in studying anatomy as well as natural history and as well as art. So I guess in this painting here, this is a little hypsilophodont, which is a little, possibly the size of a turkey, a little tiny dinosaur that was actually a polar dinosaur. And you can see it's died here by the water with the ice cracked. And they know, I guess, from when they're digging through the fossil evidence and when they're really looking at some of the fossil sediments, they can tell whether the water has been frozen or not just by little signs in the rocks. They can tell how cold the environment was so they're getting little evidence there, and they get a sense of, I guess, this little, you can see this little arrow here pointing not far from Melbourne. This is down near Envelope, where the bone of this hypsilophodont was dug out of the cliffs. And more of them have been found around the Victorian coast. So this is when Australia was really was connected to Antarctica. It was right towards the bottom of the world, but it was a lot warmer then. There were trees on Antarctica. It is not to say that it was warm, but it was a lot warmer than it is now. So again, here is a small scene based on the fossil evidence. It starts to kind of recreate a little moment in time. Another painting here by Peter Trussler. This is what's called a labyrinthodont. It's kind of like a very, very large axolotl, really big. You wouldn't want to encounter it. But that's based on just 2 bones they found. And the paleontologists, in order to reconstruct this, they try and match those bones with existing animals or other extinct animals that have been reconstructed. So there's a lot of guesswork here, but also a lot of deduction. It's kind of like detective work. But if they find these jawbones, they're jawbones that can be very emblematic of certain species, so that they know that this belongs to an amphibian. And then they can kind of work through the genera, fossil genera, and still living genera to try and chance upon exactly what animal it could be. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you've got this animal that's reconstructed from just a few bones, and then the little scattering of ginkgo leaves on the water is also just from some fossil evidence of these leaves preserved. And from those 2 bits of information and perhaps a few other bits of information, you start to create a scene. So I guess this does come back to Angkor. I'm going to move in and out of Angkor in the remaining slides, but I'm also looking at how little bits of evidence can be used to kind of reconstruct pieces. So this screenshot here is from a project. You can see the link down there. It's called the Kaaba project, and this is an ARC Center of Excellence. But one of the sub projects in this kind of large endeavor was trying to reconstruct the landscapes of Australia's past, going back 200,000 years. And to do this, they've got to get these things called pollen cores, and this is one way to get them. So how this is actually done, they're trying to get cores of sediments like these here, and sometimes they have to float a little raft out onto a lake, and they're trying to drill down to get this core of sediment so that they can then date the sediment. And if they can find pieces of pollen, tiny little fragments in there that are fossilized pollen, then they can start, from that evidence, they can get an idea of what the flora around that area was even 200,000 years ago. So this is also something they've done at Angkor as well. Some of my colleagues there, particularly Dan Penny, has been doing pollen cores at Angkor for some time. So to get to publications here, this is one of my favorite publications. It's back from 1976. There's no pictures in it, but it's called the Ecology of Angkor, and it's nothing to do with pollen coring or any scientific method. It's all to do with inscriptions. And what Judith Jacob did when she wrote this article, she was really surveying all the inscriptions of the Angkorian civilization, and there's really not that many, considering the civilization went for 500 years. I think that there's something like 1,600 or 1,800 inscriptions. You've got to remember a lot of those are just one sentence. So she's surveying all the inscriptions, and these are from all around Cambodia as well. And she's trying to find repeated mentions of where the inscriptions deal with certain species of plants or animals or minerals. So it's another way of trying to deduce some information about the ecology of Angkor through epigraphy, that's inscriptions, and how this can accord with pollen cores as well. We can't really look at this page, but that's just an example of there's 4 or 5 pages of all the linear names of certain plants, certain trees, certain spices that are mentioned in the inscriptions. And altogether, that gives you a pretty good vegetation assembly. It's by no means exhaustive. There's a lot that's missed, but these little points of evidence you can add. With this, I guess you're looking at photography around the area of this particular vegetation that existed there, that's backed up in the pollen cores, that's backed up in the inscriptions, that wasn't introduced in the last couple of 100 years. And a lot of this is to do with looking at landscape photography of Angkor in the last 10, 20 years, and also archival photography. So using this information, you start to create vegetation assemblies. But then I guess it's not just all this modeling of trees. It's also what the inscriptions say about where those trees are, and I guess the how they relate to where the inscription used to be installed. So what Judith Jacob says is often the inscriptions mention something like the extent of the god's land is from the spring to the cane forest, to the bees' woods, to the Tras Nara pool, and so on. So they're mentioning places that have now vanished, but these were little orchards and woods that were in reasonable proximity to where the inscription was, maybe hundreds of meters away, which are now gone. But they're mentioning kind of historical configurations of little settlements. And one landmark that's mentioned repeatedly is a reservoir. It's often mentioned that a reservoir was dug or an embankment was created. So the thing about these reservoirs is these have all been mapped. So when you see all these little ponds here, reservoirs, then these would have been mentioned in the inscriptions which were held in the shrine, which is the center of the village. Now, you've got to remember that very few of the inscriptions survive. Often they might have been in that shrine, but written down on paper, in which case they're gone forever. If they were inscribed on stone, they'd still be there. But what I find really interesting about all of this is that we have this map of Angkor where a lot of these fields and archaeological features have been mapped. And yet all these fields once had names. They had all kinds of names, and they were all there was a kind of a cosmology of them all. And you can see, I mean, back here when Judith Jacob was talking, said that, the inscriptions informed the local population the size and exact position of the rice fields. So in early Angkorian times, they were sometimes just given colloquial names. They were called the tamarind rice field or the eggplant rice field, whatever the orchard was around them. But they did have names. So it's a kind of a constellation of historical ecology, of which we have, just like the dinosaur fossils I showed you before, and the fossils of plant flora, you have these tiny little fragments, and then you're kind of faced with the prospect of how much you can reconstruct from them. And I guess the answer is quite a lot, but you can't do it to a high degree of certainty. So again, here's an example of this is I should mention this is the virtual map that Mike and I have been working on for some time now. It's still not done, but a lot of this imports all kinds of archaeological databases and layers that have been researched for maybe probably 30 years, but mostly in the last 10 years. We're trying to put everything together in one kind of world here. So here's an example of the rupture between what's in the map and what's on the ground. This is an example of one of those shrines today. Often there's hardly anything there, but you can get a sense of maybe if you look closely at this, you get a sense of what materials it's built out of and perhaps a certain date. This might or might not have an inscription with it. You might just have to go on the architectural and archaeological information alone. But you can see that if it did have an inscription, this particular shrine is right near the modern airport there, and all of this is wiped out. So if it did have an inscription, it would be referring to places that are now long gone, but in this area here. These are what the inscriptions look like, and even when they do survive, there's large lacuna and fragments kind of torn out of them. So there's very little to go on overall, but there's enough that you can start to assemble a kind of a scene. So the same thing with these shrines, some survive, some we can reconstruct, the rest we have to go with whatever information we can get. But the inscriptions, as you see them here, if you see the inscription here, if they were recorded in stone, they would be recorded on the door jamb just inside the shrine there. So we have all these fields which were once named, but of course they're really fragmentary. And I think I'll go through this pretty quickly because I'm already a little further along than I wanted to be. But Pat Hutchings was experimenting with this a little while ago before he left. He really got us started, but we were trying to, all these fields are disconnected, and what we were trying to do was use kind of artificial neural networks to kind of reconnect them. And why are we trying to reconnect them? Well, if we can reconnect them, we can make them into parcels. And if they're not connected, there's not much we can do. But once they're parcels, we can turn them into fields that we can flood, we can grow, we can change over time. So I guess the point here is that once we start to reconnect them, and a summer student called Max was doing a really good job of this. You can see how he with all the passes he was placing over it with deep learning techniques, you can see these long lines here are trying to connect areas that are not connected where the information is lost. It's trying to kind of heal over those. So the point here is that we're kind of starting to diverge from what is strictly the historical evidence, and we're starting to kind of, I guess, meld things over. And I guess Angkor starts, our version of Angkor starts to kind of go off in its own direction. By putting these fields back together, we're inventing fields that were never there. And these sit amongst fields that were there, that are documented, that the outlines still survive. And this is what it looks like when it's parcelized. So we've got this landscape of the past, which in this photo that I took back in 2001, that's probably not unlike what it looked like 1,000 years ago, but that's all vastly changed now. And I think even this place where I took a photograph is being turned into a golf course since, so that it's probably gone. It's also really interesting just looking outside here at Caulfield Campus that probably not everyone knows this, but there used to be a little road. If you can see this road going in here, and I think it connects up here. This used to be a road that goes through the campus. And there used to be a row of houses all along here and to the front here. There's a missing suburb, a little suburban street, and there's a missing possibly a dozen houses. I was looking around for this through, the Glen Ira archives, and I couldn't find anything about it, but I know that these houses were there because just maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, there was still one of them there. And it's kind of like, if you've seen the movie Up, it was kind of like Mr. Fredrickson. It was just one old guy was just holding out there with the whole university growing all around him. He was just holding out there. And then one day he left and they bulldozed it. But this tree, and also the tree down the road, these used to be trees in someone's front garden. They were planted when it was a suburb. So this is a 100-year-old tree. It's kind of a lost landscape. It's historical ecology. It would be a fun little project to reconstruct that little area there that is now totally forgotten. So I think I'm going to finish up in a second here, but I wanted to mention another paper I really like, and it's called Sounds of the City. It's by David Garriock. So I'll just read this through. So the quote is that cities have always been noisy places, yet on the whole, urban historians have paid little attention to urban sound, tending to assume that even if the sounds themselves were different, the role they played was similar. Yet just as people in the past interpreted the visual world differently, so too they experience sound differently from the way we do. How can we understand the terror of thunder for people who did not know what caused it, or for whom it was the loudest sound, along with cannons and large church bells, that they ever heard? How can most of us who rarely hear bells recapture the kind of vertigo produced by the sheer intensity of those church bells? Other sounds of the past, the rattle of swords and musketry and the cries of hawkers, have disappeared almost completely from our experience, and with them, the whole range of day-to-day understandings. So what David Garriock was talking about, he's talking about 18th century Europe. So, I mean, before the motor car and before the steam train, and just how different experience was, not just visually, but also through sounds. So I've done I think a pretty good job getting through 44 slides in 25 minutes. But I wanted to try something here. I'm not going to play any animations, but these are just this is a very early visualization we made of Angkor. Brent and I probably made this almost 10 years ago. But if I can play a little sound now from my desktop that we recorded as a field recording when we went to Angkor in 2018. Just have a look at the scene and see how it accords with that. So what you're hearing in the background is a recording we took in a village, and it was one of those rare moments where you can't hear motorbikes, you can't hear harvesting machines, you can't hear karaoke machines, or airplanes for that matter. You're hearing people calling out, you're hearing chickens, sparrows. There's certain types of birds that tend to like fruit trees. You can probably hear some Indian minor birds, also some turtle doves, not dissimilar to the ones we have here. These are all the sounds of settled places and people. So I guess the reason I'm playing something like that is I've always kind of wondered what if that's a modern field recording, and we kind of mix that with other reconstructions of instruments and all kinds of other sounds we put together to try and provide a soundscape for what would be a medieval city. But as everyone knows, Angkor kind of went downhill and it collapsed gradually. But one day, just everyone had left. And I wanted to also think about what would be the sound of the end of Angkor. So this is something I've thought about for a while, but it all has to do with what kind of animals move in when the people move away and when the trees start to take over. And two animals, a lot of animals move in, but two I think are really special. One is the pileated gibbon, which they're apes. These gibbons tend to move in really dense forests, and they like hills. But they're generally not anywhere where people are. They like it far from people. The other one is this cicada. It's called an empress cicada. And it's got the wonderful linear name of Megapomponia imperatoria. And if you look at the size of it, I used to be mad about kind of catching and collecting and finding cicadas when I was really young. This is just, it's the biggest cicada in the world. It's just pretty amazing. It deserves that name. And this is what that cicada sounds like. And this is a recording I took around one of the heavily forested areas of Angkor. So it's really high pitched. It can drive you a little crazy because it's incessant, and they're very large and loud. You never see them because they're a long, long way away. But these cicadas they really, you don't hear them in settled areas. They really have to live in really heavy forest. So if we think about it, these are dipterocarps. These are these giant Southeast Asian trees, and these are the trees that start to grow once everyone's left Angkor. And this is, I guess, you probably heard of that series, Life After People and so forth. This is what the kind of fascination with Angkor is. It's a civilization that we see the remnants of because it got taken over by nature. That's why everyone's so fascinated with the imagery of it. But these are the size of these dipterocarps. They really form really thick forests. So if we were to go back to this scene here that Brent put together of one of those shrines kind of choked by a ficus tree, then possibly the kind of sounds you'd hear is something like this. Those are the gibbons. So I haven't, I didn't want to animate for those. We were just talking about how, I just wanted to kind of demonstrate how sounds go with the scene and a moment in time, and how fragments can be put together, and what the end of a civilization would actually sound like. I mean, it doesn't sound all that bad. It sounds like a beautiful forest. I guess it's the very final slides I have here. I'm sorry, I went much longer than I thought I would. But I guess it's poignant. It's not necessarily nostalgic, but this is to think of what it would be like to live through the rupture of one phase into another, to live through the fall of one kind of system, the collapse of one system and the rise of another. I thought this is something that's happening, as everyone knows, it's happening all around the world. The ecosystems are changing, but none bigger than perhaps the Mekong River, one of the most famous rivers in the world. There's so many dams on it now that last year, for the first time that anyone can ever recall, it ran dry. And this has really major implications for Cambodia, for the area that I study, because this large lake here, the Tonle Sap Lake, the richest fishery in Southeast Asia, Angkor, is just here. It shrank tremendously. So the phase change that might happen, we have to see if this keeps happening, but that could cause an entire collapse of that system. And again, it just prompts all these questions of what it is to live through one phase and into another phase. What kind of ecologies, what kind of landscapes, and indeed what kind of soundscapes are lost in the process. I think I'll stop there, and I'll take any questions if anyone has any. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so Sojung's asked, that it prompts a kind of issues of representation and simulation in the historical archive and the virtual world, and the fundamental difference between the archival or archaeological simulation and the creative or subjective representation about historical memories. Sojung, these are really important questions. So when we how realistic is how realistic can we be? This is really important, and I get that there is some speculation about it. And so, yeah, the poetic representation of historical memories and events, these are also really important too. So I guess what I've introduced here as an idea is that there's kind of multiple threads here. It is kind of an archive. It's the way to look at an archive. But as I showed you with the kind of the way that we're trying to use AI to knit these rice fields back together to kind of heal over the empty areas and try to put it together as a kind of a working simulation, it is very much an idea that we have to be clear about what shreds of evidence we're bringing in here. But if we only go with the shreds of evidence, it's just very hard to get something that really it just, well, there's so much that's uncertain. There's a lot you can leave out. It doesn't to make a simulation or to make a visualization of the past. There is a lot of other elements you have to bring in. Okay. Yes. Thanks. Yep. Thanks for the link there. I'll have a look at that. And yes, I should nostalgia. Yes. Thanks, Rebecca. Yes, nostalgia. I guess that yeah. So that's a hard one, because some of this does sound like kind of exercises in nostalgia. But I think in some of these things, if we're looking at things like deep time, and if we're looking at civilizations for 1,000 years ago, I'm trying to look at that as a living civilization rather than as a ruin. And nostalgia really is often conveyed through photos of ruins. But yes, Rebecca, I'd like to talk more about nostalgia and how this kind of relates to that. These are very these are important ideas to kind of express. But I guess also what I've done is I've taken many themes and woven them together. And there's one thing I didn't include there because I kind of ran out of time, was the whole idea of, I think it's Bernie Krause, and the recordings of sounds of ecologies over 40 years. He's very, very famous. Yeah, thanks, John. I wanted to include him, but it was just another 5 slides I had to cut out. But that was, so yeah, talking about ecologies and soundscapes and linking them together. I brought in sound towards the end because really, as you can see, it's all about making models, and sounds, they are important to that. But as you can see, Mike and I and Brent and Michael and Suyin, we were trying to make these environments first, and then the sounds kind of get fitted into them later. So you have to have the virtual environment to make this, to place the sounds. Okay, so Arno asks, do these inform what type of data information to keep about our time to allow people in the future to recreate it? Wow. Yes. And I think I'd have to defer that to the archivists in a way. There's so much information. For example, I mean, just getting back to the slide I had there in the talk, I remember looking out of my window, I think it was down the hall, as the bulldozers came in and destroyed that house, that last remaining house at Monash that I talked about. I should have taken photos of it. And then I looked around on the internet, and Marda had done Muma had done an exhibition on that. But I looked at that, and there was, all I could see was the blurb about it. There was no images there. So I looked at as many photos as I could to try and find aerial photos of Monash. Couldn't find it there. So some of these things, yes, they need to be preserved as much as we can. John asks, do you think about how this work will be preserved in the future? Technology changes so rapidly. Yes, animations are pretty stable. That's one way I like to. So animations are pretty stable going into the future. It's like, you know, that there's 3D model formats. I'd love to be able to print out some of this stuff. Certainly things like Unity and stuff, well, kind of animated, I guess, animated overviews of what it does. Those are important, but that is something I've thought about, and that's it's hard it's hard to consider how many options are for recording this. John, I guess you're talking about 3D models, right? And you're talking about interactives, yeah. So yeah, there's one thing I'd like to say about animations, and that they are, it's not really feasible, but they're actually, you could print out every frame of your animation if it was 30 seconds long, and you could keep them in kind of a flip book, lock them away somewhere. You can actually preserve them as single images. It's not exactly the best way to preserve them, but that is one way to kind of preserve movement. It's kind of all these freeze frames and then lock them away. But I think little video files is probably the best way. Okay, thanks, Monica. Yep. And yeah, thank you everyone for the questions. I think I kind of need I'm having, yeah. John said 19th century you can show 3D interactive in 20. Yes, I mean images do preserve really well, John. Yeah, so maybe you can't preserve the whole thing, but it's really better than nothing. And to have images of these things that we're making and somehow archive them, that's really important. And thanks, Bernie. I think I might finish up there, guys. Thanks all for coming. Sorry, the questions are a little hard for me to answer, all coming up in chat. I just had a tutorial with my students, and it was really easy to answer their very particular technical questions, but you guys have much more nuanced questions that it's hard for me to answer. So yeah, I'll see how this goes, but that it just shows you a few other threads and strands I'm considering in my work. Okay, thanks very much, everybody, and please email me or come and talk to me if there's anything else you wanted to talk about with this. And thanks, Katie, for helping me set up. Thanks. See you.